DNA and its structure. DNA, which stands for deoxyribonucleic acid, a large molecule present in the nucleus of every cell of every organism, was discovered in 1869, named in 1899, and largely ignored until the late 1940s, when some scientists began to suspect that it could be the key to how bacteria reproduced. In 1948, the great chemist Linus Pauling used X-rays to work out the shape of proteins, which turned out to be helical, in the form of a helix. In 1953, Francis Crick and James Watson realized from X-rays of DNA that it had a double helix structure, looking a bit like a twisted rope ladder, and in a paper in Nature magazine, they commented, "The specific pairing we have postulated immediately suggests a possible copying mechanism for the genetic material." Our genes are made of DNA, a polymer that has a regular, repeating backbone with 4 kinds of side groups, known as bases, sticking out at regular intervals. The order of the bases, the way in which the 4 letters of the DNA language are combined, comprises the genetic message, which can be astonishingly long in a complex organism. Human DNA is thought to contain more than 1 trillion letters. Still, the structure is elegantly simple and quite universal. All plants and animals share the same basic DNA structure. There are 4 different kinds of genetic building blocks, connoted as capital A, capital T, capital C, and capital G. An A building block in a human is absolutely identical to an A building block in a butterfly. The difference between people and butterflies lies in the number and sequencing of the building blocks. Every human, except identical twins, has a different DNA sequencing code, yet shares the same structure of DNA with all forms of life. The discovery of DNA vindicated Darwin's intuition in On the Origin nearly a century earlier than that, when he wrote, "All living things have much in common in their chemical composition, their germinal vesicles, their cellular structure, and their laws of growth and reproduction. Therefore, I infer from analogy that probably all the organic beings which have ever lived on this earth have descended from one primordial form into which life was first breathed." Crick and Watson's discovery also upgraded the significance of genes, leading to neo-Darwinian theories, including the selfish gene. The selfish gene. Crick and Watson had shown that genes, even internally, are digital. Within a gene, everything is digital code, like a computer language, pure information in digital form. They also showed that the information transfer is irreversible. The gene passes on its information, and the information cannot be supplemented by anything that happens to the body within which the gene sits. Although the gene can be damaged if its vehicle is, for example by toxins or radiation, characteristics thus acquired, like a tan from spending time in the sun, are not passed on to any offspring. Reflecting on these facts led Oxford biology professor Richard Dawkins to publish The Selfish Gene in 1976. Instead of describing natural selection from the individual's angle, Dawkins sees it through the gene's eye. He says, "The fundamental unit of selection, and therefore of self-interest, is not the species, not the group, or even strictly the individual. It is the gene, the unit of heredity." Here is the gospel according to Dawkins. In the beginning, there were molecules. Then one day, by chance, a remarkable molecule arrived, the replicator. The replicator could make copies of itself. When copies are made, mistakes happen. The copies are sometimes not perfect. The primeval soup, therefore, began to fill up with several varieties of replicating molecules descended from the same replicator. But the primeval soup wasn't big enough to support all the replicators, so they had to compete with each other. There was a struggle for existence among the replicator varieties. The cunning replicators, the ones that survived, hit on the idea of building survival machines to live in. The survival machines, created by the replicators, got bigger, more varied, and more complex. Now, the replicators swarm in huge colonies, safe inside gigantic lumbering robots. That is, inside plants and animals. These replicators, now called genes, are in you and in me. They created us, body and mind, and their preservation is the ultimate rationale for our existence. Natural selection implies the differential survival of entities. Each gene wants to survive, to live a long time, perhaps even to become immortal. The gene survives by making an identical copy of itself. If it can house copies in a long succession of different survival machines, in animals, this means bodies, the gene may survive for a very long time. A gene is potentially near immortal, although it will only survive by collaborating with other genes inside the survival machines. Still, because all the genes can't survive, they are in competition with each other. The gene is selfish because it has been selected only to advance its own cause, to be the survivor in the game of natural selection, where there are always more losers than winners. Genes selfishly compete with their alleles for survival. The genes that survive are the ones best fitted to their environment, which, in a subtle and important twist to Dawkins' argument, includes other genes. In a theme we'll come back to in Chapter 5, cooperation turns out to be the highest form of selfishness, both for genes and for their most evolved vehicles, humans. The theory of memes. Dawkins says that the gene has come to dominate the earth, and the world of the selfish gene is one of savage competition, ruthless exploitation, and dastardly deceit. Yet, Dawkins does not say that our genes control us. Certainly the genes can try to manipulate us, but we can choose to frustrate them, for example by using contraception. Birth rates decline rapidly when the level of education of the women in a society advances. Moreover, Dawkins offers hope that we can rebel against our genes. Our species is unique, he says, in being able to pass on knowledge in the form of culture, language, customs, art, architecture, science. Humans have invented a new form of replication, a new form of potential immortality in the form of memes, which is Dawkins' word for units of cultural transmission. A meme might be a book, a play, or an idea, like Darwin's idea of evolution by natural selection. Memes are anything that can be passed on from one person to another, or one generation to another, by means of learning or imitation. As Dawkins explains in The Selfish Gene, examples of memes are tunes, ideas, catchphrases, clothes, fashions, ways of making pots or building arches. Just as genes propagate themselves in the gene pool by leaping from body to body via sperms or egg, so memes propagate themselves in the meme pool by leaping from brain to brain by imitation. Dawkins hints that a world of selfishness might conceivably be turned into something better if memes with altruistic yet successful features were to replicate faster than genes. The idea of memes is controversial. Some biologists don't accept the parallel with genes or see the relevance of memes. But to me it makes perfect sense. Memes are a human invention, yet, once created, they have a semi-autonomous life of their own. Memes replicate, vary, adapt, and incorporate themselves in robust vehicles. Memes produce ever more complex entities in a way that is very similar to genes. We should note in passing that there is mounting evidence that humans are not the only animals where cultural evolution, by which I mean learned behavior rather than an increasing appreciation of opera, interacts with and transcends genetic evolution. Research by Dr. Lee Allen Dugatkin, a biologist at the University of Louisville, shows that even creatures with low intelligence can imitate the behavior of their peers. Simple marine bugs called isopods, that are scarcely a quarter-inch long, have devised a way of copying each other's choices of mates. Female guppies, small West Indian fish, will change their minds about which male guppy to mate with if they see other females selecting a different male. And sage grouse shift what they think is sexy according to cultural idiosyncrasies that vary annually. A river goes out of Eden. In 1995, Dawkins' book, titled River Out of Eden, gave us a vivid metaphor for the spread of DNA. The river of the book's title is of DNA flowing through geological time, occasionally branching to form a new species. Each species' river contains a mass of genes, traveling downstream together as good companions. It is a river of information, Dawkins says, that passes through our bodies and affects them, but is not affected by them on the way through. Each river has steep banks, stopping the DNA of one species from getting into another species' DNA river. Dawkins draws attention to two particular features of natural selection. One, its luxuriant diversity. There are tens of millions of different species. Each species has a different way in which its DNA makes a living, and different ways of passing DNA-coded texts on to the future. And two, ancestors are rare, descendants are common. The vast majority of organisms die before they can breed. Only a few of those that do breed will have a descendant alive 1,000 generations on. All organisms can therefore look back and say, none of our ancestors died in infancy, despite infant deaths being the general rule. It follows that the process of natural selection of genes is extraordinarily discriminating. He writes, each generation is a sieve. Good genes tend to fall through the sieve into the next generation. Bad genes tend to end up in bodies that die young or without reproducing. After 1,000 generations, the genes that have made it through are likely to be the good ones. The same selectivity applies to species as a whole. Although there may be about 30 million species on Earth, these constitute only 1% of the species that have ever lived. Evolution's gate to the kingdom of life is indeed a very narrow one. The theory of lifelines. The theory of the selfish gene is controversial among biologists. Professor Stephen Rose, for example, denounces it as ultra-Darwinism and genetic reductionism. Although that may be unfair, Rose does make a convincing point that evolution happens at many levels, and that the lifeline, the progressive direction of life, includes the evolution not just of genes, but also of organisms and societies. I would add economies to the list, and no doubt Dawkins, if allowed to, would add memes. The theory of business genes. I would now like to build directly on genetic findings and on Richard Dawkins' theory of memes to arrive at a theory of business genetics that I have called, not unreasonably, The theory of business genes. What is the DNA of business, the most fundamental unit of value? I think it is economic information, and that we may think of units of useful economic information as business genes. Business genes are a type of meme, which, as we've just seen, is Dawkins' word for a unit of cultural transmission. In my definition, a business gene is simply a meme that is related to business, a unit of economic transmission. We could call them business memes instead of business genes, but I have opted for the latter because it makes the parallel with biological genes more explicit. A characteristic of biological genes is that they tend to travel in packs, and their ability to get on with a large number of other genes is crucial to their success. There are very large numbers of genes present in most animals. Biologists can separate out individual genes, but when it comes to memes or business genes, I don't see the point in trying to specify whether we are talking about individual memes/business genes or collections thereof. In practice, most economic information will comprise many different strands or units of information, many individual business genes. Examples of these business genes or groups of business genes are ideas, the design behind a basic technology such as the steam engine or internal combustion engine, or telephony, or computing, the design for a product component such as the script for a movie or an integrated circuit, the intellectual capital leading to a piece of software or the kernel thereof, or a formula, such as that for Coca-Cola or for an ethical drug. A business gene is anything intangible that comprises useful economic information that can be incorporated alone or alongside other business genes, either into a product or service, or into some vehicle or vehicles that will then provide a product or service. Business genes are the building blocks of know-how, of skills and technology in the broadest sense. They comprise economic information that needs to find a commercial vehicle before it can attain its potential and deliver a valuable product or service. Business genes are the origin of economic life. They seek to replicate as widely as possible by incorporating themselves into what we may loosely call commercial vehicles. Inanimate things like buildings, machines, software, factories, offices, trucks, and products. But also living things like people, teams, corporations, services, and economies. Animals and plants are the vehicles for biological genes, and big survival machines into which the genes put themselves. The vehicles do all the hard work to survive and prosper and propagate the genes. The same is true for business genes and their vehicles. The business genes are the invisible business ideas, the knowledge about how to increase wealth, and the vehicles are all the visible apparatus of economic activity, the moving parts, including people, firms, and physical assets, products, and services. The business genes coat themselves with physical texture in order to become more robust, to deliver products and services, and to replicate, just as biological genes need human gene machines for similar purposes. A business gene cannot survive or create value without some physical home. It must be embedded in something tangible. Even business ideas need some physicality before they can be sold or given away. They must be committed to paper or electronic record, or be communicated from one person to another. Vehicles are likely to attract good business genes to the extent that they are the best available vehicles for those genes, and they are likely to be successful to the extent that they incorporate the best available genes. The vehicles are the physical expression of economic value and exist to multiply that value. Those best adapted to prevailing economic conditions will flourish, and if the nature of the vehicles or economic conditions changes in a way that alters this fit, then the vehicles will cease to flourish. How business genetics works. Business genes, successful units of economic information, are incorporated into, create, and manipulate many generations of vehicles. These business genes and their vehicles go through a process of evolution by selection, with the struggle for survival, variation, selection, and further variation leading to change, and on the whole, to improve products and services, and to a richer, more complex, more specialized economy. Think of how a technology develops. Steam power, for example, or nuclear energy, or computing power, or something much simpler and more primitive like the wheel or fire. There are many early versions of these technologies, and they get incorporated into a large number of new products and services. Most of these early technologies and products fall by the wayside. They prove impractical or too expensive, or else they are supplanted by improved versions of themselves. Any successful technology goes through many generations of experimentation, variation, selection, and improvement. In addition, a successful technology has ancestors that themselves, by definition, survived long enough to give birth to a new technology. The gene is, depending on which biologist you follow, either the basic mechanism for evolution by natural selection, or the most basic level at which evolution occurs. It is a river of information, flowing not through space, but through time. The gene incorporates itself into plants and animals, in machines that are vehicles for its survival. Although they compete with other genes, successful genes have the ability to collaborate with fellow successful genes operating in the same survival machine. You can see the parallel for technologies or units of economic information or competencies, ways of doing useful economic things. The technologies, and so on, incorporate themselves in products which evolve because of the competition occurring between other technologies and because of the competition between the products themselves. The products with the best business genes tend to survive and multiply and produce better versions of themselves. But what is driving the process is not the products themselves, but the skills and technologies behind them. What survives is not the products, but the useful economic information and technology, the way of doing something useful that flows into and out of many generations of product. And although technologies compete with each other, as biological genes do, they have to be able to coexist and collaborate with other successful technologies in order to adapt to the environment, just as biological genes must collaborate with many other genes. And what, for technologies or useful economic information or competencies, constitutes the environment? It is other technologies, and so on, customers and markets, where the business genes have to prove their right to survive by competing with other economic resources. Business genes in a movie. What, for instance, is the equivalent of the genetic code in a movie? At one level, it may appear to be the digital master recording, from which many copies can be made for movie theaters all around the world. The master recording can then be made into a video, a compact disc, or any other product that can incorporate it. But the digital master recording is itself a vehicle, not a business gene or collection of business genes. The acid test of whether something constitutes a business gene is whether it is information or something tangible. Information constitutes business genes, but tangible things, such as recordings or robots or products or machines, are vehicles for business genes. The business genes are the information that goes into the movie and the information that it generates. This includes the skills and reputations of its actors, director, producer, and so forth, all of which comprise data of economic value that can be incorporated in future movies and other products. But note that the movie is not the only relevant vehicle for the economic information. The reputations of the actors are carried by the people themselves, as well as by the movie. For the same business genes, there are usually several vehicles of similar types, for example, different movies, and different types, for example, actors as opposed to movies. At an even more basic level, the genetic information lies within the script itself. What really matters is not the physical script, the paper or tape or disc on which it is written, which are vehicles, but the ideas it contains. Business genes generally are intangibles that have economic value, like stories, customs, ideas, ways of doing things, and the most basic levels of technology. The ideas behind the technology, rather than the prototypes or other physical expressions of it. To qualify as a business gene, 3 conditions must be met. First, the business gene must be valued, either for its own intrinsic appeal or because it can help to deliver other things that people want, or help to deliver them to a higher standard or with the use of fewer resources. Second, the business gene must be capable of being replicated. Third, it must be intangible. These 3 conditions have always been met for the ideas behind successful scripts, like the Book of Genesis, or Romeo and Juliet, or indeed Newton's Principia Mathematica. All of these have been valued, and all have been copied, varied, and incorporated into a huge number of derivative products and other vehicles. The genetic code for novels, for instance, is the 8 basic plots of which all others are said to be variants. Take, for example, a video on how to sell more effectively, perhaps one made in the 1970s starring John Cleese. After a time, the video will die. Who nowadays wants to see those flared trousers and those garishly colored wide ties? But if the video has been successful, the concept behind it will comprise the real genetic code, the business genes that will live on and be used again in other styles and media. Humans and business genes. Where do we humans fit in this scheme of things? Can we be business genes? Or are we always vehicles for business genes? I've suggested 3 qualifications necessary for a business gene. 1, it must add value. 2, it must be capable of replication. And 3, it must be intangible. Humans can pass the first 2 tests, but not the third. We can't be business genes. We are never ideas, technologies, ways of doing things, or economic customs. We can create ideas in the first place, and we can take ideas and capitalize on them. Either way, we are vehicles for the ideas and for their replication. But hang on, I hear you saying. If we can create ideas, create business genes, surely we are their masters rather than their servants. Does this not mean that the parallel with biological genes breaks down? We cannot create biological genes. They create us. Yet surely we can create business genes and they cannot create us. If you're saying this, you're right. Remember that what I have called business genes in fact form a subset of memes, Richard Dawkins' term for the social and intellectual replicators that humans have created as an additional evolutionary method to that of genes. Humans create memes. We create business genes. But humans also stand in a very interesting relation to business genes. We are both their creators and their vehicles. The same is true for all memes. We use business genes and are used by them. We can propagate business genes that we did not invent. Indeed, this is the normal course of economic progress. For every human inventor of an idea, there can be hundreds or even millions of people who use and develop that idea. Most people who become rich through business do so by using other people's ideas, not their own. Mainly, they will elaborate the idea somewhat, so they may create a few minor business genes. But the source of their fortune is mainly the powerful business gene or collection of business genes that they appropriated from elsewhere. This is precisely the evolutionary process, where a few powerful business genes are replicating very successfully through a process of variation and continual better adaptation to the environment. We humans are occasional creators of the main business genes, more often the creators of minor business genes, and most frequently of all, our role is simply to orchestrate the replication of existing business genes. Are there different types of vehicle for business genes? There are two different types of vehicle for business genes, the animate and the inanimate. The former, those that have a life of their own, comprise humans and systems that incorporate human endeavor, including teams, organizations, parts of organizations, cities, and economies. These are all self-organizing systems, a term that we shall meet later in this book. They come together, at least partly, of their own volition, and create something that is more than the sum of the parts. The latter, the inanimate vehicles, include machines, products, physical embodiments of technology, like cables and telephone lines, buildings, offices, and trucks, and other vehicles in the usual sense. The animate, self-organizing systems behave very differently from the inanimate objects. But that is a story for later in this book, and especially for Chapter 9. For our purposes as students of business genes, both the live systems and the inanimate objects are vehicles for the business genes. The only difference is that human elements contained within the self-organizing systems can create business genes as well as serve as their vehicles. A new perspective on business. Instead of corporate competition being the focus of study, as in the old economic paradigm, business genetics posits several layers of economic value creation, which is driven by business genes and their struggle for life and reproduction. Humans have multiple roles in the process as creators of business genes, as users of business genes to create better products and services, and as consumers of products and services, and therefore arbiters of their survival, spread, and demise. Corporations are important intermediate vehicles, but there are many other types of vehicle, and corporations derive their power from being the best vehicles for business genes and for their creators, the entrepreneurs and knowledge workers. Small companies go bust all the time, in large numbers. Although this is painful, it is a necessary part of economic progress. The companies that are better suited to the environment, which largely means the market, survive and are stronger for having to face competition. As the great economist Joseph Schumpeter told us in 1942, capitalism progresses via a process of creative destruction. When a company is destroyed, it frees up resources for better use elsewhere. There is nothing sacrosanct about corporations. As vehicles, they are only useful to the extent that they are the best possible incarnation of business energy and information. If that business energy and information would be better developed elsewhere, we should throw away the old vehicle and use or create another one. Large companies are less likely to go bust than smaller ones. They have become large companies by being one of a small minority of small companies that have been very successful. The large companies have undergone a long process of selection for the privilege of being big. Yet large companies can set the cause of business evolution back if they use their size, as many do, to insulate themselves from competition. This may work for a time, but natural selection says that insulation from competition halts, or at least slows down, improvement in products and services. Common sense and observation tell us the same. Selection also tells us that someone, somewhere, will be experimenting with new products or technologies that may eventually become a challenge to the sclerotic old firm. The reckoning can be postponed but not averted, and when the firm eventually faces competition, it may quickly crumble. Think of the near collapse of IBM. Think of the actual collapse of the Soviet Union, which at one time must have been, among other things, the world's largest corporation. The process of killing off firms that have outlived their usefulness will be accelerated if we adopt the business gene view of corporations. Vehicles that are no longer working well should be abandoned by healthy business genes, and sooner rather than later. Spin-offs. Spin-offs are growing in popularity, but are still not used enough. I use the term spin-off loosely to mean not just firms that are still owned by the proprietors of the original firm, but also those where the key players come from a common parent and bring with them important parts of its knowledge or customer base. Is it a coincidence that industries where there are many spin-offs also tend to grow faster than other industries and also deliver faster increases in value to customers and investors? Think high-tech. Silicon Valley is stuffed full of spin-offs. Think management consulting. Think venture capital. Think investment banking. Spin-offs and team moves, a sort of halfway house to a spin-off, are endemic in such industries. In boring industries, where progress comes in arthritic snail paces, spin-offs are rare. Perhaps if there were more spin-offs, these industries would become more interesting and successful. Natural selection predicts what happens with spin-offs. The new firm takes with it much that is good from the old firm. It inherits the latter's good genes, but it also adds new twists. If the innovations suit the market, the spin-off prospers. Spin-offs from the successful spin-off then repeat the process. No one wants to spin off from an unsuccessful firm. Typically, the owners of successful firms do not benefit from spin-offs. The children go their own way, and the parent gets no benefit. How much better for the owners of the successful firm if they can have a share of the spin-off? That this does not happen more often is due to a lack of foresight, combined with managers' natural reluctance to risk the creation of new, independent units that will not be under their control. Yet, natural selection points to a different model. Every successful firm should have many spin-offs. Owners who act in time to back promising spin-off ideas, and if necessary overrule their managers, can capture a share of the value created by the spin-off. If you want to give nature or the market a helping hand, take part in a spin-off. Now, let's complete our theory of business genes by looking at one final piece of genetic research dealing with the problem of inbreeding. The Hardy-Weinberg Law. The study of genes has shown why taboos on incest are well-founded. We carry harmful alleles that do not get expressed because they are recessive and occur in only one copy. The odds against two similar alleles fusing are very high, but inbreeding cuts the odds against this misfortune considerably. Also of interest is the Hardy-Weinberg Law, discovered independently in 1908 by British mathematician G.H. Hardy and G.H. Weinberg, a German physician. The law says that the probability of inheriting a particular allele from a parent is exactly as high as that of passing it on to a child. The allele frequencies do not change. Inbreeding and the Hardy-Weinberg Law are useful concepts in thinking about how evolution is restricted in a technology, product, company, market, or nation when there is no significant change in its gene pool. Take the case of an organization. The gene pool is not just the skills of the senior executives. It comprises all the important inputs to the firm, including what suppliers contribute, what technologies and distribution channels are used, how customers are used to help the firm improve, what investments are utilized, all collaborative networks, which are not confined to suppliers. Important collaborators for high-tech firms, for example, include individuals and teams within universities who may not have any contractual relationship, and all employees and new recruits to the firm. Inbreeding occurs when this total gene pool is not sufficiently replenished, changed, and stirred. Options for change should continually be evaluated. Business Genetics for Executives. 6 Action Rules. 1. Use the best business genes available. There are 3 ways to deploy business genes. One is to create them from scratch, invent a new product or service, or a new business system. This is a rare event, and few of us have the originality required. A second way is to appropriate and use successful business genes. Remember, the genes want to multiply, so they are amenable to being used. But to do this successfully, you may need to get there ahead of other people who might have the same idea. For instance, my friend Raymond Ackerman, who created the Pick and Pay supermarket giant in South Africa, used the idea, the business gene, of self-service supermarkets after it was already well established in the U.S., but before it had become so in Africa. A third way is to take an already successful business gene and modify it slightly, create a new variant of the business gene. 2. Make yourself an excellent vehicle for successful business genes. To use successful genes, you must further their purpose and help them multiply. This requires adaptation on your part. Adaptation requires exposure to competition. Don't seek to insulate yourself from internal or external career competition. If you do, you'll stop developing. Compete in the major markets, not in the backwaters. Beware of working in corporate pyramids which insulate executives, especially senior ones. 3. Use the best vehicles available to drive them. You are a user of economic information. You are the skills that you have, including the skill to collaborate with successful business genes and other vehicles for them. with other individuals, with teams, and with organizations. You are the value added. You are the driving force. The team or company you join, the other resources you commandeer, are vehicles for you. The vehicles are there to advance your purpose, to provide protection, to incarnate your energy. Remember that the vehicles are just that, and the only reason to work through one is if it is the best possible vehicle around for your purposes. Continually ask yourself, am I driving or being driven? Am I driving the right vehicle? And is there anywhere else I could add more value? 4. Career evolution requires variation, a series of new jobs, whether or not you change firms, and new ways of doing the existing job. Start a project. Take on a new responsibility. Change the furniture. Identify new business genes that can provide you with fresh direction and for which you can be the best vehicle. 5. Evolution requires continual experimentation and improvement. If you don't produce a new generation version of yourself as quickly as your career competitors do, you'll fall behind. Experimentation and improvement require fresh combinations of new business genes, new skills, new ideas, new ways of working. Remember that your success requires you to be a vehicle for excellent combinations of business genes, and to work within or alongside other successful vehicles. So experiment all the time with new combinations of genes and vehicles. And finally, 6. Evolution requires failure. The greatest and most abundant freedom that the universe offers is the freedom to fail. For most organizations, this means an early death, and it is the species that benefits. Fortunately, in careers, we always get another chance. But constructive mutation in your character and skills requires failure, as well as the maturity to recognize and accept this. Don't let your ego deny the fact of failure. This is another form of competitive insulation. Accepting failure and using self-development processes to benefit from it can free you to compete. Failure is easier to accept and to reverse in the context of business gene theory. It results from being a good vehicle for poor business genes, or from being a poor vehicle for good business genes. Identify which is the case, and take appropriate, corrective action. Summary. Mendel's laws, Thomas Hunt Morgan's experiments, and the discovery of genes showed how inheritance operated and added a micro-dimension to evolution. Specific traits can mutate, not just new species. Crick and Watson's discovery of DNA and its structure reveal the common links between organisms and the fact that evolution is driven by passing on information. Richard Dawkins' brilliant theory of the selfish gene gives a new perspective on evolution, where the gene is the driving force and organisms are merely vehicles for genes. Dawkins' theory of memes proposes that humanity has developed a new form of replication, units of cultural transmission, information that can leap from brain to brain and can supplement or even compete with selfish genes. I have proposed a parallel theory of business genetics based entirely on insights from Mendel, Hunt Morgan, Crick and Watson, and Dawkins. Business genes are basic units of economic information, intangible ideas of value that can be replicated to create yet more value. These are what ultimately drives improvement. Business genes are created and used by individuals and teams. But once created, the business genes have a life of their own. They seek to incorporate themselves into as many vehicles as possible in order to spread themselves widely. The vehicles fall into two categories: machine-like objects and self-organizing systems, including individual executives, teams, and organizations. The vehicles produce products and services, which themselves thereby also incorporate business genes. At all levels, the business genes, the vehicles, and the products, the same process of evolution by selection operates. Business genes survive and spread by being the best of their type. The process spawns many new variants and many dead, redundant business ones. The vehicles survive and prosper by being the best vehicles for the best business genes. They will be cast aside by the business genes when this is no longer true. The products and services are produced by the vehicles and incorporate the best business genes. The products and services also face a struggle for existence, with new and improved versions continually replacing earlier ones. This view of business moves the center of gravity from the corporation back to the fundamental sources of value, to business genes, to the genetic code of business, which is useful economic information. Fundamental value does not reside in products or services, nor yet in the vehicles that produce them, corporations and the physical things that they own, but in the ideas, formulae, and technologies that drive the vehicles. The best business genes will always seek out the best vehicles, and if a better vehicle becomes available, the business gene will drive that vehicle, leaving the earlier vehicle stalled. To create value, individuals may create new business genes, although these genes are slippery and impossible to control. You must also create and keep the best vehicle for the genes, or they will go elsewhere. However, value may also be created, rather more easily, not by creating new business genes, but by identifying valuable business genes that are underexploited, because the appropriate vehicles for them have not yet been created. Genes need vehicles. They can identify the best available, but cannot necessarily create the vehicles themselves, and in business, this results in opportunities for individuals to create appropriate vehicles. Value can also be created by combining business genes in new permutations and providing new vehicles for the new mix of genes. Action implications. 1. Identify business genes that are underexploited and that are having to make do with poor vehicles. Create the best new vehicles for existing powerful business genes, for valuable economic information, ways of working, and technologies. 2. Join existing successful business genes into new combinations and provide appropriate vehicles for the new combinations. 3. Make yourself the best vehicle for a winning and unique combination of business genes. 4. If you participate in running an organization, realize that its value derives from being a vehicle for successful business genes. Ensure that the organization is and remains the best vehicle for the genes. See that the organization's gene pool is continually replenished with new inputs that have already proven their success. And finally, 5. Create spin-offs and spin-outs from existing organizations. Chapter 3. On Gauss's Laws. Competitive strategy is about being different. It means deliberately choosing a different set of activities to deliver a unique mix of value. Michael Porter. Gauss's principle of survival by differentiation. Soviet scientist G. F. Gauss did some very interesting experiments on small organisms. He put two protozoans of the same family but different species in a glass jar with limited food. The little creatures managed to cooperate and share the food, and they both survived. Then Gauss put two organisms of the same species in the jar with the same amount of food as before. This time, they fought and died. I call this Gauss's principle of survival by differentiation, or PSD for short. Later in this chapter, I'll explain why I think the PSD is so important, but for the moment, trust me. Try to keep Gauss's organisms in your mind's eye, because if there is one image I'd like you to take away from this whole book, it's probably that of Gauss's protozoans and the PSD. Incidentally, Darwin anticipated the results of Gauss's experiment in Chapter 3 of On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. He wrote, "The struggle for existence almost invariably will be the most severe between the individuals of the same species, for they frequent the same districts, require the same food, and are exposed to the same dangers. As species of the same genus have usually some similarity in habits and constitution, and always in structure, the struggle will generally be more severe between species of the same genus, when they come into competition with each other, than between species of distinct genera. We can dimly see why the competition should be most severe between allied forms, which fill nearly the same place in the economy of nature." Gauss's principle of competitive exclusion. Gauss's experiments also led to the conclusion that two competing species can only coexist if there is more than one scarce resource. Two populations compete if one lowers the growth rate of the other. They may do this by eating each other's lunch, crowding each other's space, or playing their Walkman so loud that the other population commits suicide. Whatever. Coexistence, dominance, and bistability. Gauss found three outcomes from the protozoan wars. 1. Two species both invade each other equally. The boundaries between them break down. They end up coexisting in the same space. 2. Only one of the species invades the other. It ends up dominant. The invaded species is wiped out. And 3. Neither species invades the other. Like the late lamentable arms race, there is a balance of power that ensures peace. Biologists call this bistability. Ecological niches and MacArthur's warblers. In ecology, a niche is not just a place where a particular creature lives. It is also a way of making a living, a special way of obtaining resources, a specialized job, or, in Darwin's happy words, a place in the economy of nature. Ecologist Robert MacArthur has shown that for warblers, a spruce tree is not a spruce tree. It is actually several different niches for several different types of warblers. Apparently, each type of warbler has its own bit of the tree to which it does different things. Each warbler has its own small and specialized ecological niche. It turns out to be quite difficult for ecologists to map the boundaries between ecological niches, but the principle is clear and very useful. Each separate niche sustains just one specialized type of plant or animal. Note that the specializations are carried to a very high degree, and that each creature does just one thing in one place. The warblers in the forests of the northeastern United States are strong believers in Adam Smith's division of labor, the principle of specialization allowing higher productivity. Finding unique niches. The first lesson from Gauss's principle of survival by differentiation is that you want your competitors to be at least slightly different from you. They can be of the same family, but not of the same species. Now, remember that there are perhaps 30 million species on Earth, so making your firm a separate species, if it isn't one already, shouldn't be impossible. If two organisms of the same species compete in the same space with a limited market, think here of food, they will fight and die. If they are different, they can cooperate and both live. MacArthur's warblers found different parts of the spruce tree because they were different types of warbler. They had found unique niches, each warbler with its own bit of the tree. So your firm needs unique niches, places where no one else can go because they aren't exactly like you. The places can be particular customers, geographic markets, channels of distribution, products, technologies, or any other source of differentiation, but at least one of these must be unique to your firm. Otherwise, you are the same species as your competitor, slugging it out in the market equivalent of Gauss's glass jar. Bruce Henderson, who found his unique niche as founder of Intellectual Strategy Consulting and who was a keen student of biology, put it well. He said, "Competitors who prosper will have unique advantages over any and all competitors in specific combinations of time, place, products, and customers. Differences between competitors is the prerequisite for survival in natural competition. These differences may not be obvious, but competitors who make their living in exactly the same way, in the same place at the same time, won't prosper."